Hello, and welcome, fans of horror, a genre of gaming that's seen its share of different faces, playstyles, mechanics, and types over the years. From Resident Evil to Silent Hill, we've seen revolutionary changes as time has passed. From the first games that taught us to be afraid of an electronic algorithm to more modern titles that both turn horror on its head or ease them into more combat-focused genres. My name is Charles.
I'm Zach.
And I'm Alex.
This is Obscured Gaming in association with
Criticalblast.
And this is Tormented Souls. Tormented Souls is a survival horror inspired by the original Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark series. With a fresh twist on the fixed perspective adventure, Tormented Souls modernizes for a new generation as Caroline Walker investigates the mysterious disappearance of twin girls in a terrifying mansion. The game starts off with our protagonist in what we can assume is her home, receiving a letter that piques her curiosity to a degree that she wishes to seek answers. From the beginning, she finds herself assaulted and immediately put into the horrors that the Wildberger Mansion-turned-hospital has to offer. For anyone whose children or parents may be expected to walk in on them, you will also find some horrors of your own in terms of some of the upfront nudity. Don't worry, this is not a lasting game mechanic, nor is this a game that would be considered smut. Though at this juncture, I would like to comment on our heroine's unique manner of dress. A crop-top leather jacket, one-piece skirt, and what appear to be more heavy boots. Not quite sure what the motif here is. Postmodern punk? Frolic in a field with a hint of rebellion? Regardless, our main character is thrust right into the action. The game moves quickly with some initial disturbing imagery, and a prelude to the game's mechanics. The first of which being a monkey wrench that you need to examine and adjust to be able to exit the room. What, do I need to flick the wick every time I want to light the lighter? But really, this is an important mechanic because it's a simple way to ease the player into some of the primary puzzle mechanics. In order to progress, you will need to examine, interact, and possibly alter or combine items in your inventory to make them usable. The controls follow a PS1-style tank control scheme, but if you just so happen to have one of them newfangled analog stick controllers, it is also supported for a more 360-degree movement scheme. This will be a curiosity to new gamers who may not have experienced this era of gaming. And those who grew up with said controllers will either feel a nostalgic sense of fun, or wonder why any game would want to go back to this control scheme. Before you ask, those who fall in the latter category, no, the controls are not a part of the horror atmosphere. It should be noted, at this point, we used a combination of play from the Steam and PS5 versions. The controls took some getting used to with the fixed camera angles, as Caroline doesn't move in relation to the camera, but rather her orientation at the time. This makes sense, or else you'd likely find yourself pacing back and forth between two fixed camera angles. The Steam version was played using mouse and keyboard, while the PS5 version obviously utilized the controller. It definitely holds true to its roots, presenting a dark, compelling, and interesting range of rooms at the beginning, and continuing on with the brilliant visuals, even when you are able to turn on the lights. And further, when you are in a mixture of light and dark situations. The presentation is lovely, and reminiscent of those games we came to know and love.
The game utilizes notepads for the tutorial system, which is effective in giving you the ability to pick them up and refer to them if need be. There's no overlay that cuts you off from gameplay or characters speaking in a manner like, press the shift key to perform an action. While I could understand a preference in completely omitting this function, I feel it's the best way to try and introduce new players to the style of gameplay, and allow veterans to not be bothered with needless pop-ups or immersion-breaking voice tutorials.
The fixed camera adds to the nostalgic feel of the game, giving you an idea of what the developers want you to see and not what you would like to see. This is effective in any horror game, because the rattling chains and bump in the night atmosphere around corners you cannot peek into makes the survival aspect that much more apparent. Sadly, this strength also becomes its own weakness. When item management is important, so too is being able to know what to expect when heading into a new area. But hey, it's a part of the challenge, so keep that in mind.
The item management system ranges from simple mechanics of key items, as briefly touched on before, to conservation of health and ammo supplies. But when it can take a full clip of nailer ammo to take down one wheelchair-bound, knife-happy boy, I don't like the idea of him wheeling up to me in a blind hallway spot where running into him might be the result, or flinging myself into a wall where, again, dodging might not be optimal. Though it should be noted, dodging does contain iframes. However, enemies range from spasmodic actions to let you know they will be attacking, to no tells at all. This can be problematic, because, again, in a game where I'd like to conserve all the resources I can, An enemy doing the equivalent to a cheap shot to the jaw is not necessarily optimal, especially in a narrow hallway or plot-important room I'll have to return to. This, however, again, plays into the very idea that you shouldn't allow an enemy to get close to you, period. Which means, unfortunately, using more ammo, or taking risky chances with your melee weapon. Enemies seem to have a chance to stagger as opposed to a definitive hit counter. This can mean, with the lack of tell, that melee combat risks an unfortunate hit that could cost you dearly later. But it is important to note that monsters, at least through most of the game, stay dead once you kill them. There is the odd instance of new monsters in areas once you progress the story so far, but ammo and medical supplies you utilize will not go to waste, for the most part.
This brings us to the save mechanic, another terrifying mechanic of the game that creates anxiety just from the notion. We like to call it the one tap, one save. That's right, your saves are limited here by the number of tapes that you find, which means that you even want to conserve your saves only by necessary. This creates a cost-benefit analysis. For every wary gamers where I personally found myself saying, have I really made enough progress to justify saving? On the plus side, you're given multiple save slots, so you could by all means utilize these other save slots, just in case if you're not sure. Then if you mess up and use too many resources, you can simply use your other save files and go back to a simpler time.
Oh god, a much, much simpler time.
Finally, for our game's primary mechanics, we have our puzzles. Puzzles in the game range from simple use item A with component B to find plot-relevant diary entries. They give you the answer you seek. Interestingly enough, the A to B mechanics are often more annoying than the critical thinking puzzles, because they require a lot of backtracking and not just a simple go here or there mechanic. More often than not, we find ourselves having to look for multiple rooms in which we do remember existing, but not exactly where they were. Sure, there were some instances where you already had the items you needed for an A to B puzzle, but for the most part, the critical thinking puzzles are given to us right before or during the puzzle we encounter. This could be intentional, as obviously the thinking puzzles need you nearby the clues.
The plot is focused around the main character, Caroline Walker, and her endeavor to discover the secrets of Wildburger Hospital. Along the way, you encounter monsters, mirrors, reminiscent of Link Between Worlds and Mirror Layers, where your actions in an alternate universe affect the real world, so to speak, and a surprisingly calm priest. A lot of the strengths of this game come from exposition, in the form of diary entries. You learn about characters in the world by reading, but diaries also contain the answers to some of the more complex puzzles that the game has to offer. The priest definitely has an old man in the cave vibe, where he shows up at plot important sections only to give you advice or an item that you need at that time. For instance, when you first meet him, he gives you a nailer, literally giving us the impression that it's dangerous to go alone, so take this. And that's what we call a classic NES Zelda quote. The father provides direction as to general sense of what to do next, but not specifics, which honestly would be kind of nice, but it's understandable that he's not programmed to know exactly how far that you've progressed until his next appearance.
Speaking of the priest and how helpful he is, puzzles are what you might expect from an old school game. Some require trial and error, some require some critical thinking, but there's never an instance where you weren't given some kind of clue as to how to solve it. This can range from simple orientation of the items in your inventory all the way up to reading clues from notepads or logs. Some of the puzzles, however, can be a little bit obscure in terms of their meanings, hence the trial and error aspects. The main problems with these puzzles are that they continue to compound in a sort of laundry list of items eventually. From the beginning of the game, you're presented with multiple locked doors and puzzles that you will need to solve. This becomes an issue when it comes to casual gameplay because in the player's mind, you have so much to remember, and it obviously leads to a great deal of backtracking. This makes sense for a game, however, from a smaller developer because reutilization of assets is an effective time budget system from a development perspective. For the player, however, this can lead to instances where you will find an item and instantly know where it goes, but not the backtracked area or areas that you need to go to first in order to make use of the item. This could lead to frustration or the possibility of players putting the game down, not because they're scared, but because they need to cool off or they need time to think. One of said problems in this category was a puzzle that we first found to be intriguing, yet it quickly became obsolete, when a specific puzzle at first generates a shortcut, which seemed brilliant at the time, but immediately after we were forced to progress the same usable item towards a different end, and it rendered the previous puzzle obsolete. While we liked the initial presentation, the backtracking involved seemed like unnecessary padding after the fact.
Speaking of padding, in the beginning enemies trained us that they can die and stay dead. However, an enemy is employed at one point in the game wherein it does not die and requires only temporary stunning. The enemies have also been unable to change rooms, but this enemy does not wander much like the classic Mr. X, but rather seems to appear in the next plot-relevant area, making it out to be more of a constant bother and necessitates the use of ammo to keep him away rather than utilizing stealth or tactics to draw them from the path of progression. This is not inherently bad per se from a horror perspective, but when thus far I've been given the ability to slay enemies, and suddenly I have a Resident Evil nemesis on my tail that I wasted way too much ammo on the first time I encountered them, it doesn't do well to make me feel that the game respects what I have learned so far. Change is not a bad thing in a game, but the game itself is relatively short, and the previously talked about fast pacing does not lend well to elements that have been pre-established thus far. That being said, this particular monster does hold a plot relevant point, so it's a neutral pass. We see where the developer was going with it.
Suppose at this point we should talk about the voice acting. It's honestly a great step above the old Resident Evil games, but there is a sense that the recordings were done isolated from one another in certain voice lines, and occasionally characters are talking in a way that does not reflect the gravity of their current situation.
What is going on here? This place is infested with nightmarish creatures. I need to be strong. I can't quit now. I've discovered that a surgical procedure is to be performed on 2 twin girls. I hope I can get to the operating room in time. There's something dark going on, something grim.
Finally, we can talk about what makes this game great. There is a good sense of dread that comes with how the story is presented. The foreshadowing elements lend a good deal to making the player wary of what's to come from an early point in the game, where jump scares are not going to be the primary aspect of fear against the player. Atmosphere is important and well established here. The game doesn't rely on simple darkness to try and get the scares across. Fear comes in flavors relating to limited saving options, combat mechanics, and unexpected visuals and sounds. But again, these are never presented as simple jump scares. The monsters are grotesque, effective, and jittery. They have an unsettling appearance, with twisted flesh and spasmic reactions. Some can fake you out at the beginning, but you quickly learn to adapt to the playstyle and the combat dodging mechanics as needed. That being said, we found that there is a natural progression in terms of combat mechanics and abilities for the player. To present these elements concisely, at first the player will find themselves placed into the game with no enemies and no weapon to speak of. However, as they progress, they will meet their first monster and almost instantly find the initial weapon. This weapon is weak, and while you will find abundant ammo, it also requires a lot of shots to put an enemy down. This plays well into the combat mechanics of the game and conservation of ammo ideals. The general idea is to either avoid an enemy entirely using alternate pathways or staircases, thus conserving precious ammo and possibly medical supplies, or to engage only those enemies who are encountered in narrow hallways or plot-relevant areas that you will return to again and again. This is where the melee comes into play again. This general idea is to first put an enemy down with a ranged attack, or multiple with the nailer, and then to finish them off when they are prone with the crowbar. The crowbar will become your best friend in terms of handling enemies to the death from start to finish. However, it should not be your primary mode of attack. As touched on previously, many enemies can attack with little to no tell. This means you should approach every fight in a cautious style. Don't let an enemy near you, or if you do not go for more attacks than what you would consider safe. Many monsters will attack immediately when they recover from being prone, unless you stun them as they recover, which some monsters simply don't suffer from. However, this is simply a matter of learning and retention, not necessarily a flaw in the game, but could be hard for players who are not used to brace and attack style combat. As the game progresses, you are given a more powerful arsenal which can knock enemies prone instantly, and a more convenient light source, allowing you the utilization of weapons in areas where you previously could not use them. This is something to note because of the fact that these new weapons allow you to either attack and kill, or simply knock an enemy down and make your way by. This does well in the short span of the game to try and combat the previous backtracking and elements wherein you might feel as though you have wasted time, or the game had you find a path only to prevent you from progressing via the utilization of a conveniently placed melee turret. While the game does stick true to its purpose of emulating old-school horror titles such as Resident Evil and Alone in the Dark, it brings back mechanics that aren't necessarily timeless, but rather outdated. This could be an intentional feel from the developer in order to rekindle old feelings of horror titles, and what would still make them special in a sea of horror games that are released today that rely too heavily on combat, stealth mechanics, or jump scares, and not enough on atmosphere and playstyle that grants us the feeling of dread that comes with monster encounters, management of essential items, forcing us to view the world in a limited scope, and puzzle solving that is not generally just 2 feet in front of your face. While the game has its flaws in terms of backtracking and some monotony, it definitely reminds us of those titles wherein budget is limited, and in order to make the most of a game and to give consumers something to really sink their teeth into, it tries its best to utilize what it can, and make the puzzle elements frustrating, but in the end rewarding to cross items from the list that was made initially. One really has to admire the dedication that came with ensuring that the game was beautifully presented, the attention to detail in some areas to keep them feeling interesting to find, the designs of monsters, and the thought that went into designing puzzles that could be figured out but aren't necessarily apparent at a glance. In some cases, the game works against itself in utilization of the very same properties that give it its strengths, but understandably so when one is working on emulation of a bygone era of gaming. P-Cube Games and Abstract Digital did well to capture the feelings of older titles, but should this be considered as a return of the classic horror genre? Or does it prove why this era of gaming is generally regarded as outdated nowadays? That we leave up to you to decide. Thanks so much for watching our review of Tormented Souls. Thank you P-Cube Games and Abstract Digital, and thank you
Criticalblast.
If you like this review, why not consider giving this video a like? And if you'd like to see more of our content, review or otherwise, keep an eye out for us on
Criticalblast.
and consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. We'll try and ensure you won't regret it. Take care.